Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. The midday sun was beating down on Oak Hollow High that day, like it was trying to cook the old brick building alive. This little rural school, tucked out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless rows of cornfields swaying lazy in the breeze, it was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened. Kids were usually half asleep by noon, doodling in notebooks or sneaking texts under desks. But that day, right around lunchtime, everything went to hell. The PA system crackled to life with this shrill, ear-splitting buzz, made you wince just hearing it, before a robotic voice cut through. Emergency alert, biohazard detected. Lockdown now. No explanation, no please stay calm, just that cold, clipped command echoing through the halls. You could feel the air shift, like the whole school held its breath. Down in the biology lab, Mia Torres was already on edge. She's this 16-year-old junior, scrappy as hell, small but tough, with these fierce brown eyes that could stare right through you. She'd been twitchy all morning, doodling her dad's old truck in the margins of her notebook. He'd vanished 2 years back, no note, no trace, and it still gnawed at her, left her jumping at shadows. So when that alert hit, she was the first to react, dropping her pencil and sliding off her stool, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as she ducked behind a desk. The room was a mess of noise, chairs scraping, kids yelling, books thumping to the floor. She peeked over the desk's edge, her breath catching in her throat, and that's when she saw it. A dissection tray on the lab table tipped over with a clatter, spilling this pig heart they'd been cutting up earlier. It hit the tiles with a wet smack, and the preservative it was soaked in, this rancid chemical stink, started bubbling and smoking like it was alive. The puddle hissed, spreading out in thin, oily tendrils, and Mia's stomach flipped. She muttered under her breath, "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could even process it, this kid, Tommy, quiet guy, always wore those beat-up hoodies, lurched up from his stool across the room. His skin was all wrong, pale and stretched tight over his bones, like he'd aged 50 years in seconds. His jaw hung slack, drooling this thick black sludge that dripped onto his shirt. And then, God, you wouldn't believe it, he lunged at Sarah, the girl next to him. She didn't even have time to scream before his teeth sank into her throat with this awful wet rip. Blood sprayed everywhere, hot and red, splattering across those faded anatomy charts on the wall, the ones with the muscle diagrams Mia used to trace with her finger when she was bored. It pooled on the floor, steaming against the cold tiles, and the whole room erupted into chaos. Screams, desks crashing over, kids shoving to get out. Right next to Mia, her little brother Luca was crouched down, pressed tight against her side. He's 13, a skinny freshman with this shy way about him, always watching, never saying much. His hands were shaking bad, clutching this jagged metal ruler he'd snatched off the desk, the kind with a sharp edge from years of wear. His voice came out small, barely cutting through the shrieks around them. "Mia, it's alive!" She glanced at him, his wide eyes locked on Tommy, and she could hear the panic rattling in his chest, his breaths coming fast and shallow. She grabbed his arm, pulling him closer, her own heart hammering so hard she thought it might bust out of her ribs. "Stay down," she hissed, her voice rough but steady, trying to keep him grounded while her mind raced. Then the lab door flew open with a bang, slamming against the wall so hard the hinges groaned. Zane Carter stumbled in, all wild energy and spiked black hair, his leather jacket slick with something dark and wet. Gore, Mia realized as the coppery smell hit her nose. He's 17, this punk kid she'd known since middle school, always carrying that switchblade like it made him invincible. But right then, his usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by this raw, wide-eyed panic. "They're eating the hall!" he roared, his voice cracking as he waved his arms, blood dripping off his sleeves onto the floor. Mia caught a glimpse past him. Out in the hallway, shadows moved fast, too fast, and there were these guttural howls mixed with screams that made her skin crawl. Behind Zane, Mrs. Ruth Bell shuffled in, calm as you please, like she was strolling into a PTA meeting. She's this 55-year-old home ec teacher, soft-spoken, always wearing these pastel cardigans. Today it was a pale pink one, smudged with flour from some morning baking lesson. She had her sewing kit tucked under her arm, this little floral pouch she never went anywhere without, and she just stood there, peering around with these weirdly bright eyes. "Oh my," she murmured, almost to herself, her voice lilting like she was commenting on a burnt casserole, not a bloodbath. Mia caught that glint in her gaze. Something off, something that made her gut twist, and she filed it away, too busy surviving to dwell on it. Last one through the door was Coach Pete Dunn, barreling in like a linebacker late for practice. He's 38, broad-shouldered and gruff, the kind of guy who'd yell at you to run laps till you puked. His track whistle dangled around his neck, swinging as he moved, and he had this tire iron gripped in his meaty hands, knuckles white. "Lab's a death trap," he bellowed, his deep voice booming over the chaos, his face streaked with sweat that ran down his jaw and soaked into his polo shirt. He kicked the door shut behind him with a heavy thud, the wood rattling in its frame, and spun around, barking, "Help me with this." He pointed at a steel cabinet by the wall, tall, dented, full of old lab supplies. Mia was on her feet in a second, shoving her shoulder into it alongside Zane and Dunn. The thing screeched as they dragged it across the floor, metal grinding on tile, and slammed it against the door just as someone, started pounding from the other side. That's when the window shattered. Glass sprayed inward with a sharp crash, glittering in the sunlight as it scattered across the desks. This thing, it used to be a kid, maybe from the senior class, smashed through, its claws slashing the air, ragged nails caked with dirt and blood. Mia didn't think. She lunged, snatching a metal probe off the table, the kind they used to poke at specimens. Her boots slipped on the bloody tiles as she drove it right into the thing's eye, the steel sinking in with a sickening squelch. Hot blood gushed over her hands, sticky and thick, running down her wrists and dripping onto her jeans. She yanked the probe free, her stomach heaving as the zombie slumped, its body twitching once before going still. But it wasn't over. There was this gurgling noise, low and wet, coming from the sink in the corner. Mia spun around just as the drain erupted. Black water shot up, splashing against the ceiling, and these decayed fingers clawed their way out, scraping the porcelain with a nails-on-chalkboard screech. The zombie hauled itself up, its head lolling, jaws snapping with this guttural shriek that echoed off the walls. Zane was on it fast, his switchblade flicking out with a metallic snick. He slashed its throat in one quick move, black gore spraying out in a wide arc. Some of it hit Lucas square in the face, and he flinched, wiping at it with his sleeve, his breath hitching as the stuff smeared across his cheek. Then came the worst part. This locked specimen fridge in the back, it was one of those old industrial ones, bolted shut with a padlock, started rattling like something was kicking it from the inside. The metal groaned, hinges creaking, and then it burst open with a loud bang, the door slamming against the wall. Out stumbled this zombie, pig guts dangling from its jaws, slimy and pink, swinging as it staggered forward. Its teeth snapped at the air, and Mia caught a whiff of that rancid preservative again, mixed with rot so thick it made her eyes water. Dunn didn't hesitate. He swung that tire iron like he was batting cleanup, connecting with the thing's skull. The crunch was loud, bone splintering, and the zombie dropped, its blood sizzling as it hit the floor, eating into the tiles with tiny wisps of smoke. The air turned heavy, humid with this wet, rotting stench that clung to your throat, and out beyond the broken window, howls started rising from the cornfields, low at first, then louder, rolling in like a storm. Mia gripped the probe tighter, her knuckles aching, and glanced at Luca, who was staring at the shattered glass, his ruler still trembling in his hands. Whatever was out there, it was coming closer, and they were running out of time. So there they were, barricaded in that lab, the world falling apart around them. Mia's hands were still slick with blood, her chest tight as she listened to those howls creeping in from the fields. The fluorescent lights overhead started flickering, buzzing like angry bees, and the dusk was settling outside, turning the cornfields into this gray, hazy blur. They couldn't stay put. The lab was a coffin waiting to close. Mia wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving dark smears, and turned to the group, her voice cutting through the tense quiet. "We gotta move," she said, trying to sound sure even though her insides were churning. "Auditorium's got stage doors, those might hold." And that's when they made their break for it. slipping out into the hallway where the real nightmare was just getting started. The lab was starting to feel like a pressure cooker by the time dusk rolled in, the kind of heavy twilight that turns cornfields into a sea of gray shadows stretching out beyond the busted window. Mia stood by the PA system, her fingers smudged with dried blood as she twisted the dial on the wall-mounted box. Static crackled through the speaker, loud and scratchy, spitting out that same damn alert on a loop. Lockdown now. No updates, no voices, just that hollow, mechanical order bouncing off the walls. She slapped the side of it with her palm, muttering, "Come on, give us something." But it just hissed back at her, useless. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans again, the denim stiff with gore, and took a quick scan of the room. Luca was hunched over by the desk they'd been hiding behind, his skinny frame practically swallowed by his oversized hoodie. He was scrubbing at that jagged ruler with the sleeve of his shirt, trying to get the black muck off it. His hands were trembling, making these little jerky movements, but he didn't say a word. That quiet of his, it stood out against all the chaos, like he was holding something and nobody else could see. Mia watched him for a second, her chest tightening, then flicked her eyes over to Zane. He was slumped against the wall near the barricaded door, his switchblade still in his grip, the blade catching the dim light as he twirled it nervously between his fingers. His leather jacket was a mess, stained dark, but what got her attention was his leg. He'd shifted his weight off it, and under the rip in his jeans, she could see this ugly oozing bite from that fridge zombie. The skin around it was swollen, leaking this thick, reddish mess that soaked into the fabric. She stepped closer, squinting, and said, "Zane, that looks bad. Let me." "I'm fine, back off," he snapped, his voice sharp and jagged, cutting her off mid-sentence. He yanked his jacket down over the tier, hiding it, and glared at her with those dark eyes of his, daring her to push it. His bravado was cracking, though. You could hear it in the way his breath hitched, see it in the sweat beading on his forehead. Mia held his stare for a beat, then let it go, turning away. She didn't have time to argue. "All right," she said, more to herself than him. "We can't stay here. Lab's a dead end. We hit the auditorium. Those stage doors are solid. They'll hold." Her voice came out steady, even though her gut was twisting with this cold, gnawing dread. She glanced at Luca again, and he was just staring at her, unblinking, his eyes wide and glassy like he'd seen something she hadn't. It sent a shiver racing down her spine, but she shook it off, nodding toward the door. "Let's move." Coach Dunn was already on it, heaving the steel cabinet aside with a grunt, the metal scraping the floor with this high-pitched whine that set your teeth on edge. "Hall's our shot! Go!" he barked, his tire irons swinging at his side as he waved them out. Zane shoved off the wall, wincing as he put weight on that leg, but he didn't complain, just gripped his knife tighter and followed. Mrs. Bell trailed behind, her pastel cardigan swaying as she shuffled along, still clutching that sewing kit like it was her lifeline. She didn't say much, just hummed this faint little tune under her breath, some old lullaby maybe, soft and out of place. Luca stuck close to Mia, his ruler back in his hand, and they slipped out into the hallway together, the lab door thudding shut behind them. The hall was a damn nightmare. The flickering lights overhead cast these jagged shadows that danced across the blood-slick tiles. Pools of it everywhere, some red, some that black sludge, streaking the floor like someone had dragged a mop through it. Lockers hung open, dented and smeared, papers and backpacks scattered like a tornado had ripped through. The air smelled sharp, metallic, mixed with this faint whiff of mildew from the old building. Mia's sneakers squelched as she moved, sticking to the mess, and she kept her probe raised, her knuckles white around it. She could hear Dunn's heavy breathing behind her, his whistle clinking against his chest with every step, and Zane's boots scuffing unevenly. He was favoring that leg bad now, but he didn't slow down. They didn't get far before trouble hit. This trashed bathroom up ahead, the door was half off its hinges, swinging loose, suddenly exploded with movement. A zombie lurched out, fast, its torn hoodie flapping as it tackled Mia to the ground. She hit the tiles hard, her back slamming into the floor, breath knocked out of her in a sharp gasp. Its teeth snapped inches from her neck, this hot, sour stink rolling off it as drool dripped onto her cheek. She fumbled for the ruler Luca had dropped, her fingers brushing it, then gripped it tight and rammed it up through the thing's lower jaw. The metal punched through with a wet crunch, and gore flooded down, warm and sticky, soaking her shirt and pooling under her shoulders. She shoved it off, scrambling up, her chest heaving as she wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing the mess. Before she could catch her breath, there was this loud bang from above. A ceiling vent, one of those rusted grates, burst open, showering dust and bits of plaster. Another zombie dropped down, claws out, and raked Zane's back as it landed. He yelled, this raw, pissed-off sound, twisting around with his switchblade already swinging, but Dunn was faster. He stepped in, tire iron arcing through the air, and smashed it right into the thing's ribcage. The impact was brutal. Bones cracked like dry twigs, and a spray of blood hit the wall, splattering across a faded Go Wildcats poster in this crimson streak. Zane staggered, clutching his back, but waved Dunn off with a growled, "I got it!" even though you could see the pain etched in his face. They pushed forward, the auditorium doors looming ahead, big, double-wide ones, painted this chipped maroon. But a pack of those things was waiting, blocking the way, their red eyes glinting in the half-light like embers about to go out. There were 5, maybe 6, hunched and twitching, their growls rumbling low in their throats. Zane didn't wait. He charged, all wild energy, his switchblade flashing as he slashed throats in a frenzy. Black blood arced through the air, splattering the walls and floor in these messy, glistening arcs, and one of them dropped with this gurgling wheeze that made Mia's skin crawl. Dunn swung in beside him, tire iron cracking skulls, while Mia kept Luca close, herding him toward the doors. That's when she heard it, this skittering sound, fast and uneven, coming from above. She looked up just in time to see a zombie scuttling across the ceiling on all fours, its nails digging into the cracked plaster, bits of it raining down. It dropped right behind Luca with a wet snarl, landing heavy on the tiles, its jaws snapping. He froze, eyes huge, and Mia didn't think. She spotted a fire extinguisher hooked on the wall, yanked it free with a clang, and hurled it with everything she had. It smashed into the thing's head mid-leap, metal crunching bone, and the zombie hit the ground twitching, its skull caved in. "Go, go!" she shouted, shoving Luca through the doors as the others piled in behind her. They made it to the stage, this old wooden platform creaking under their weight, littered with splintered props from some abandoned play. Dunn and Zane dragged a busted piano over, shoving it against the doors with a groan of wood on wood, while Mia grabbed a stack of chairs, piling them up fast, her arms burning from the effort. The air in there was thick, heavy with this musty smell of decay that clung to everything, and out in the fields, you could hear distant screams cutting through the dusk, sharp, desperate, fading quick. She leaned against the barricade, catching her breath, when she noticed Mrs. Bell off to the side. The woman was sitting on a prop crate, calm as ever, humming that same damn tune, something slow and lilting, like "Rock-a-bye Baby." She'd pulled out her sewing kit, threading a needle through a torn curtain from the pile, stitching it up with these neat little loops. Mia squinted, her stomach turning as she saw the needle glisten, coated in this thick, rancid liquid, same color as that lab spill. Belle glanced up, catching Luca wiping more blood off his face with his sleeve, and smiled, this serene little curve of her lips that didn't match the hell around them. "Keeps my hands busy," she said softly, almost cheerful, and went right back to her stitching. Mia didn't like it, didn't like her, not one bit. She turned away, checking on Luca, who was staring at the floor now, his ruler back in his grip. The auditorium felt like a cage, those screams outside getting closer, and the stage lights flickered overhead, throwing long shadows across the bloody costumes scattered around. They'd bought some time, sure, but night was falling fast, and whatever was out there wasn't done with them yet. And that's how they ended up holed up on that stage, the cornfields turning black under the night sky, the whole school groaning like it was alive and pissed off. Mia kept her probe close, her fingers aching from gripping it so long, and started sweeping the space with her eyes, looking for anything they could use. The tension was thick, everyone on edge, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. Night had settled over the auditorium like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating, turning the stage into this dark, shadowy pit. Out beyond the walls, the cornfields were just a rustling black wall. You couldn't see a damn thing, but you could hear the stalks whispering against each other in the wind, this constant shh that made your skin prickle. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with that musty rot smell from before, and the stage creaked underfoot like it might give way any second. Coach Dunn was pacing near the edge, his flashlight cutting through the gloom in shaky sweeps. The beam caught on bloody costumes strewn across the boards, tattered wigs, a ripped velvet cape, all soaked red like someone had dumped a bucket of paint over them. Then it landed on something worse, a prop axe bent at a weird angle, lying next to a kid's severed arm. The hand was still curled tight around a crumpled script, fingers pale and stiff. Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry as she muttered, "Jesus, that's from the drama club." Her voice barely carried over the low hum of the flickering stage lights. Mrs. Bell was perched on that same prop crate, legs crossed like she was waiting for tea to steep, her sewing kit open on her lap. She was threading that needle again, the one with that nasty, glistening liquid, and she glanced up at the mess like it was no big deal. "Preservative turned bad. Rats got into it," she said, her voice soft and eerie, like she was explaining why the cookies didn't rise. She didn't even flinch at the arm, just kept stitching that torn curtain, her fingers moving steady and sure. Mia frowned, something about it rubbing her wrong, but before she could say anything, Luca leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "She's wrong," he whispered, his voice hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far off. Mia turned to him, startled. His face was pale, his eyes locked on Belle, and that emptiness in his tone sent a cold jolt down her spine. "What do you mean?" she hissed back, keeping it low, but he just shook his head, slow and silent, like he couldn't explain. Across the stage, Zane was a mess. He'd slumped against a prop table, one of those rickety things covered in chipped paint, and his leg was trembling bad now. Mia could see it even in the dim light, black veins snaking up his thigh, bulging under the skin like twisted roots, creeping higher every time he shifted. His jeans were torn wider, the bite from that fridge zombie oozing this thick, dark sludge that dripped onto the floor with a faint plop-plop. He caught her staring again and snarled, "I ain't dying." His voice was ragged, spit flying as he shoved off the table and lurched toward her. Before she could dodge, he slammed his hands into her shoulders, knocking her back hard against the table's edge. The wood dug into her spine, and she grunted, pain shooting up her back as her probe clattered to the stage. Zane loomed over her, his breath coming in short, angry bursts, stinking of sweat and something sour. "Back off, Mia! I'm fine!" he barked, but his eyes were wild, pupils blown wide, and she could see the lie in the way he swayed. Dunn stepped in fast, his boots thumping on the boards as he tightened his grip on that tire iron, the metal glinting under the flashlight's beam. "Ease up, Carter," he growled, his jaw clenched tight, the muscles in his neck bulging like he was ready to swing. Zane shot him a glare, chest heaving, but he backed off, stumbling a little as he turned away, muttering curses under his breath. Mia rubbed her shoulder, wincing, and scooped up her probe, her hands shaky but her mind racing. She glanced at Dunn, then at Luca, who was still watching Belle like a hawk, and she could feel the tension coiling tighter, like a rubber band about to snap. That's when the whole place shook, a guttural thud rattled the rafters overhead, dust sifting down in little clouds. Mia looked up, heart pounding, and saw the catwalk swaying, this rickety metal walkway strung with old stage lights. Then it happened. Zombies clawed through, their nails screeching against the steel as they tore it apart. One dropped right onto Dunn, hitting him with a bone-crunching crash that knocked him flat. The thing's weight pinned him, its jaws snapping at his face, and he roared, swinging his tire iron up in a wild arc. It smashed into the zombie's spine with a wet crack, gore splattering across his weathered cheeks, streaking his sweat-soaked skin. He shoved it off, scrambling up, but the chaos didn't stop there. Zane, God Zane, was already gone. His eyes flared this bright, feral red, glowing like brake lights in the dark, and he let out this guttural roar that didn't sound human anymore. He spun on Belle, who was still sitting there, calm as ever, and lunged, sinking his teeth into her shoulder with a wet snap. She gasped, this sharp little sound, and her sewing kit tumbled to the stage, needles scattering with tiny pings. Blood bloomed through her cardigan, dark and fast, and Mia didn't hesitate. She charged, probe in hand, and slashed it across Zane's throat. The steel sliced deep, and blood gushed out in a steaming arc, hot and black, splashing across the stage and pooling around the props. A broken chair, a fake sword, all of it dripping now. Zane slumped, his body hitting the boards with a heavy thud, his switchblade skittering away into the shadows. But the backstage doors, they weren't holding. They burst open with a splintering crash, wood flying, and more zombies poured in, their growls filling the air like a chorus of death. Luca moved fast, surprising Mia. He darted forward, ruler raised, and stabbed one right in the eye. The metal sank in with a squelch, and the thing's claw raked his arm as it fell, leaving a jagged scratch. He didn't even flinch, his face blank, like he didn't feel it. Mia's breath caught as she saw it. His wrist from back in the lab had this blackening scratch, the edges turning dark and veiny, creeping up his skin. "He's bit," she gasped, her voice breaking, raw with panic as she grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back. Her eyes stung, tears blurring her vision, but Dunn was on her in a second, his big hand clamping around her arm. "We need him alive," he growled, his voice rough and urgent, dragging her toward the center of the stage. The trapdoor was their only shot, a rusty square cut into the boards, half hidden under a pile of old curtains. Dunn kicked the fabric aside, his boot thudding against the wood, and yanked the hatch open with a groan of hinges. "Down, now!" he shouted, shoving Mia toward it. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge, and dropped into the darkness below, her sneakers hitting concrete with a dull smack. Luca followed, sliding down smooth and quiet, and Dunn came last, pulling the trapdoor shut with a heavy slam that echoed above Belle's wet snarls. She was still up there, clawing at the air, her hymn turning into this dying guttural wail. The basement storage pit they landed in was dank and cold, the air thick with this sharp chemical bite, formaldehyde, leaking from barrels stacked along the walls. The lids were chewed open, jagged edges glinting in the faint light from Dunn's flashlight, and Mia gagged as the smell hit her full on, burning her nose. Then she saw them, a writhing mass of dissected rats spilling out, their tiny bodies slick with that same rancid liquid Belle's needle had been dripping with. Their red eyes glinted like pinpricks in the dark, and they scuttled forward, claws clicking on the concrete, this relentless little tide of squeaks and scratches. Mia gripped her probe, her chest tight, and backed up a step, whispering, "What the hell is this place?" The walls seemed to close in, pipes dripping overhead with a steady plink-plink, and whatever they'd just escaped from upstairs, it was nothing compared to the mess waiting down here. So there they were, trapped in that basement pit, the rats closing in, the air choking them with fumes. Mia's hands were slick with sweat, her mind spinning as she tried to figure out what Belle had been messing with, and why Luca wasn't acting right. The trapdoor rattled above them, something heavy slamming against it, and they knew they couldn't go back. They had to push deeper, figure out what was fueling this nightmare. That basement pit was like stepping into a damp, rusty coffin. The air hit you hard, thick with formaldehyde fumes that stung your eyes and made every breath feel like you were swallowing acid. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping this steady plink-plink of water onto the concrete floor, and the walls were lined with these old metal shelves, all sagging and crusted with rust. Mia was crouched near a janitor's cart she'd spotted in the corner, this beat-up yellow thing with chipped paint and a wobbly wheel. She'd yanked a gas can off it, one of those red plastic ones with a dented side, and her hands were trembling as she worked the cap off. The smell of gasoline cut through the chemical haze, sharp and familiar, as she twisted a rag into a tight fuse, her fingers fumbling a little from the adrenaline still pumping through her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, muttering, "Gotta make this quick," her voice low but steady, like she was talking herself through it. Luca was standing a few feet away, just outside the pool of light from Dunn's flashlight. His skinny frame was hunched, his hoodie sleeves pulled down over his hands, but Mia could see his wrist where the fabric had ridden up, this oozing black scratch, the edges puffy and dark, leaking slow like tar. His breathing was shallow, this raspy little hitch every time he inhaled, and when he shifted, his eyes caught the light, just for a second, and flickered with this faint red glow. It made Mia's stomach twist up tight like she'd swallowed a rock. She paused, the gas can still in her lap, and stared at him. "Luca, you okay?" she asked, soft, almost pleading, but he didn't answer, just stood there, quiet as ever, his head cocked slightly like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. Dunn was pacing near the barrels, his boots scuffing the gritty floor, tire iron swinging loose in his grip. He was panting hard, sweat rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of his polo shirt. "Belle messed with it," he said, his voice rough and worn out like he'd been yelling too long. "Rats went feral. Whatever she did, it started this." He kicked one of the barrels, a hollow clang ringing out, and a trickle of that rancid liquid oozed from the chewed-up lid, pooling on the concrete. Mia glanced over at Belle, who was slumped against a shelf a few yards away, her pastel cardigan hanging off one shoulder. The bite Zane had given her was pulsing, black veins spidering out from it across her pale skin, and she was grinning, this wide, unhinged smile that didn't match the situation. "It's growing," she cackled, her voice dripping with this mad, giddy edge that made Mia freeze mid-motion, the fuse half-twisted in her hands. "Can't you hear it?" Belle's head tilted back, her eyes glinting in the dark, and Mia strained to listen. Nothing but the drip of the pipes and the faint squeaks of those rats somewhere deeper in the shadows. Luca shifted then, stepping closer to Mia, and muttered, "It's loud." His voice was flat, distant, and he tilted his head the same way Belle had, like he was tuning into some signal. Mia's skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking out on her neck. "What's loud, Luca?" she pressed, leaning toward him, but he just stared past her, his eyes unfocused, that red flicker coming and going like a bad bulb. Before she could push him further, the shadows moved, this lanky figure stumbling out from behind a stack of crates. It was Dr. Alan Gray, the sub-science teacher, this twitchy 42-year-old ex-vet who'd been filling in for weeks. His lab coat was soaked through with blood, clinging to his gaunt frame, and he was clutching a cracked beaker in one hand, the glass chipped and smeared. His glasses were fogged up with sweat, sliding down his nose as he tripped over a loose pipe and caught himself on a shelf. "She spiked the preservative," he stammered, his voice high and shaky, pointing at Belle with the beaker. "Tested it on rats last week, thought it'd be some breakthrough." He was breathing fast, almost hyperventilating, and Maya could see the fear etched deep in his face, his hands trembling so bad the beaker rattled. That's when the floor gave way, not all at once, but with this low, grinding rumble. The dirt under their feet shifted, and then it erupted, zombies clawing up through the concrete, their hands breaking through like roots busting out of soil. One grabbed Mia, its claws slashing her thigh as it yanked her down. She hit the ground hard, pain flaring hot through her leg, and its weight pinned her, its breath this rancid gust against her face. She stabbed her probe into its throat, the steel sinking in with a wet hiss and blood mixed with the fumes, burning her lungs as she shoved it off, rolling to her knees. Her jeans were torn now, a warm trickle running down her shin, but she didn't have time to check it. Across the room, Zane's corpse, God, it was Zane again, twitched upright from the shadows where he'd fallen after the explosion upstairs. He staggered forward, his throat still gaping from Mia's slash, letting out this guttural moan that echoed off the walls. Dunn didn't blink. He swung his tire iron in one brutal arc, crushing Zane's skull with a dull thud, the body crumpling back into the dark. But Belle was on her feet now, moving fast despite that bite, and she lunged at Gray. Her teeth sank into his neck with a wet crunch, blood spraying across the shelves in a wild arc, splattering old textbooks and jars. Gray screamed. She fed them rot, his voice gurgling as he clawed at her, but it was too late. Mia grabbed the gas can, her hands slick with sweat, and struck a match from the janitor's cart, the tiny flame flaring bright. She lit the fuse, yelling, "Get back!" as she tossed it toward the barrels. The explosion was deafening, a deep boom that shook the pit, tearing a wall apart in a blast of heat and dust. The force knocked them all sideways, Mia slamming into Dunn as they stumbled through the gaping hole it left, landing in a flooded tunnel beneath the school. Water sloshed around their ankles, cold and murky, and the air was alive with the squeals of those rats, hundreds of them, swarming in the dark, their tiny claws scraping the stone like a relentless tide. Luca was up ahead, his growl rising over the noise, low and guttural, his silhouette flickering in the faint light as he moved deeper into the tunnel. Mia clutched her probe, her thigh throbbing, and shouted after him, "Luca, wait!" But he didn't turn back, and the shadows swallowed him up. So there they were, splashed into that flooded tunnel, the school groaning above them like it was about to cave in. Mia's leg was screaming, her hands still tingling from the blast, and Dunn was hauling himself up beside her, tire iron dripping with water and blood. The rats were everywhere, their red eyes glinting like little warning lights, and Luca was slipping away, that growl echoing back like a promise of something worse waiting ahead. That tunnel under Oak Hollow High was a disaster waiting to happen. The walls were trembling, slick with this ankle-deep muck, cold, slimy water mixed with dirt and God knows what else, sloshing around their legs with every step. You could hear the school collapsing up above, this distant roar like thunder rolling through the earth, bits of dust and pebbles raining down into the flood. The air was so thick with rot it coated your throat, this wet, earthy stench that made Mia gag every time she sucked in a breath. She was dragging Luca through the sludge, her arm hooked under his, her sneakers slipping as she fought to keep him close. His growl was getting deeper now, this guttural snarl that didn't sound like her little brother anymore. It rumbled out of his chest, low and mean, and his arm was a mess. Black veins were snaking up toward his pale face, bulging under his skin like twisted wires, and his head lolled a little, like he was fighting to stay upright. "Come on, Luca, stay with me," Mia muttered, her voice rough and desperate, her free hand clutching that probe like it was the only thing keeping her sane. Dunn was a few steps behind, hauling Dr. Gray's limp body through the water. The vet's lab coat was soaked through, dragging in the muck, and his neck bite was oozing this black tar, like oil seeping out of a busted engine. He was still alive, barely, his chest hitching with shallow gasps. "It's spreading. Rats carried it," he choked out, his voice wet and gurgling, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. His glasses were gone now, lost somewhere in the chaos, and his eyes were wide, darting around like he could still fix this. Dunn didn't even look at him, just kept trudging, his tire iron dripping water as he gripped it tight. Then Gray's head jerked, his eyes flaring this sudden, bright red, and Dunn stopped cold. "You're done," he muttered, low and flat, dropping Gray into the muck with a splash. Before the vet could move, Dunn swung the tire iron down hard, crushing his skull with a sharp crack. Bone gave way, and Gray went still, the water rippling red around him. Mia flinched at the sound, her stomach twisting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The tunnel shook again, harder this time, and the ceiling started to give. Muddy clumps fell, then hands, zombies clawed through, breaking the earth apart like it was paper. One dropped right onto Mia from above, slamming her down into the water with a heavy splash. She went under for a second, the cold shocking her system, and came up spitting, teeth snapping inches from her face. She could feel its hot breath, this rancid gust, as she slashed her probe across its jaw. The steel caught, tearing through with a wet rip, and blood sprayed out hot and thick, splashing across Luca's chest in a wide arc. She shoved the thing off, scrambling up, her hands shaking as she wiped water from her eyes. But Luca, he yanked free from her grip, sudden and wild, and bolted deeper into the tunnel. His laugh echoed back, this chilling, guttural sound that bounced off the crumbling walls, nothing like the kid she knew. "Luca!" she shouted, her voice cracking, but he was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. Dunn grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as more shapes moved ahead. A shadow loomed up from the muck, tall and shambling, and Mia's heart stopped. It was her dad, his old vet clinic coat shredded to rags, hanging off his bloated frame. His face was decayed, sagging and gray, snarling through cracked lips as formaldehyde dripped from his swollen hands, plinking into the water. He died 2 years back, heart attack, they said. Donated his body for science, and it ended up in the school's storage, forgotten until now. The flood had woken him, pulled him up from whatever slab he'd been rotting on. "He's been down here," Dunn rasped, his voice tight as he swung his tire iron at a swarm of undead rats scuttling through the water. Dozens of them, their tiny claws clicking fast, red eyes glinting like sparks. Mia just stared, her breath caught in her chest, whispering, "Dad?" Half a question, half a plea, but he didn't answer, just staggered closer, his snarl growing louder. Behind them, the tunnel was flooding with more zombies, clawing out of the walls and churning the muck with their thrashing. Mia snapped out of it, gripping her probe, but Luca, he came back into view, and he wasn't her brother anymore. His eyes blazed red, bright and feral, and he lunged at Dunn with this savage snap of his teeth. He sank them into Dunn's shoulder, tearing through the polo shirt, and Dunn roared, a deep, pained bellow that echoed down the tunnel. He swung Luca off him, slamming his head against the stone wall with a sickening crack. Plaster chipped away, and Luca slumped, dazed but still growling. Dunn staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers, and Mia saw it. His eyes flickered red, just for a second, as the infection surged through him. His snarl joined the noise, this rising cacophony of growls and splashes as the horde closed in tight, their shapes blurring in the dark. Mia backed up, her sneakers slipping in the muck, her chest heaving as she yelled, "Dunn, hold on!" But he waved her off, his voice rough and breaking. "Get out, go!" he barked, swinging his tire iron at the rats and zombies piling in. She turned, splashing through the water, her dad's decayed figure still lumbering toward her, and the tunnel walls groaned louder, cracks spidering up the stone. Whatever was left of her family, her school, it was all collapsing, and she had to keep moving, even if it meant leaving them behind. So there she was, running through that crumbling tunnel, the water dragging at her legs, the horde right on her heels. Dunn was fighting, but he was fading fast, and Luca, Luca, was lost to her now. She burst out into the cornfield next, the night air hitting her like a slap, and the real reckoning was just beginning. Mia burst out of that tunnel like she'd been shot from a cannon, stumbling into the cornfield beyond the school, with her chest heaving and her legs barely holding her up. The gas can was long gone, spent in the basement blast, and her hands were slick with blood, sticky and cold now, as she dragged Dunn's tire iron through the mud. It scraped along, heavy in her grip, leaving a jagged trail behind her. The fog rolled in thick, coiling around her like a damp shroud, so dense she could barely see 10 feet ahead. It clung to her skin, chilling the sweat on her face, and out behind her the school was a glowing wreck, flames licking up into the sky, painting the night orange. You could hear faint sirens wailing in the distance, probably from town, but they were too far off to mean anything yet. She sucked in a ragged breath, the air tasting of smoke and wet earth, and muttered, "Gotta keep going," her voice shaky but stubborn, like she was trying to convince herself. Then she heard them, staggering steps splashing through the muck behind her. She turned, tire iron raised, and there they were, Luca and Dunn, coming out of the tunnel like ghosts from a bad dream. Luca, her shy little brother, wasn't shy anymore. His flesh was peeling off in wet strips, hanging loose from his arms, and his snarls were thick with this black drool that dripped into the mud. Dunn was right behind him, the gruff coach turned into this shambling wreck, his polo shirt torn to rags, his face sagging like melted wax. Their eyes glowed red, bright and hungry, cutting through the fog. Mia's stomach lurched, but she tightened her grip, her knuckles aching. "Luca, please," she sobbed, swinging the tire iron at him. It cracked against his arm with a sickening snap, loud enough to echo through the cornstalks, and he stumbled, his growl cutting off for a second. "Come back to me," she begged, tears streaking down her face, mixing with the dirt and blood smeared there. But he lunged again, teeth bared, fast and wild. She dodged, her boots slipping in the mud, and shoved him hard, sending him face first into the muck. His growl was swallowed by the wet squelch as he thrashed, trying to get up. Dunn was on her next, tackling her with this clumsy, heavy lunge. His red eyes were wild, his breath hot and sour as he pinned her down, the mud soaking through her jeans. She twisted under him, panic flooding her chest, and rammed the tire iron up through his jaw with a desperate thrust. The steel punched through with a wet crunch, blood gushing out hot and dark, splattering her arms as he slumped into the dirt beside her. His body twitched once, a little shudder, then went still, his weight sinking into the ground. Mia rolled away, gasping, her hands shaking so bad she almost dropped the tire iron. She wiped her face with her sleeve, smearing the mess, and whispered, "I'm sorry," her voice breaking as she stared at him, the fog curling around his crumpled form. But the cornfield wasn't done with her. The ground started rumbling, this low, uneven shake, and then it erupted. Zombies clawed up from the soaked earth, their decayed hands tearing through the stalks like they were paper. Students, staff, people she'd known. They were drenched in the tainted floodwater that had spread from the school's pipes, their uniforms and clothes hanging off them in soggy tatters. Their movements were jerky, relentless, and the noise, their growls mixed with the rustle of the corn, it was deafening. Mia staggered back, her boots sinking deeper, and then she saw him. Her dad, rising up among them. His bloated corpse grinned, this awful lopsided stretch of his decayed face, his vet clinic coat flapping in the wind. A swarm of dissected rats and pigs scuttled around his feet, their squeals sharp and piercing, cutting through the night like a dirge. She froze, her breath hitching, and whispered, "No, not you too," her voice barely audible over the chaos. It hit her then, what Belle had done, that spiked preservative. It wasn't just a screw-up in the lab. There'd been a storm a few weeks back, a real soaker, and it must have seeped into the groundwater, poisoning the fields, waking up every buried body in the region. The flood from the school had spread it, triggered it all, and now the whole damn area was coming alive, or undead anyway. She gripped the tire iron tighter, her hands numb, when Luca crawled upright again. Mud caked across his face, his red eyes locked on her, and he lunged, faster than before, sinking his teeth into her leg with a savage tear. She screamed, this raw, throat-scraping sound, and kicked him off with a burst of adrenaline, sending him sprawling back into the stalks. Pain shot up her leg, hot and sharp, and she could feel it, the infection burning up her veins, this creeping heat that made her vision tint red at the edges. She stumbled forward, the tire iron slipping in her grip, and swung it one last time at her dad. It cracked his skull with a wet crunch, the sound muffled by the fog, and he dropped, his bloated hands splashing into the mud. But it was too late. The rats and zombies swarmed over her, their claws snagging her clothes, dragging her down into the corn. She thrashed, kicking and swinging, her breaths coming in choking gasps as the stalks closed in around her. The school's firelight faded to a dull glow, the sirens still wailing somewhere far off, and her final shriek, hoarse and desperate, cut through the night before the fog swallowed it whole. The horde buried her, a writhing, bloody mess, and the cornfield went quiet again, just the rustle of the stalks and the crackle of distant flames. And that's how it ended. Mia swallowed up by the mess she fought so hard to escape. The whole region turned into some kind of waking graveyard. The sirens kept coming, sure, but by the time anyone got there, it was just fog and fire and whatever was left crawling through the fields. Crazy, right? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.